Hello, my name is Joseph Kabuleta, and I'm here to talk to you about an economic civil war that has been raging on in this country for the last 35 years. Now, we all know about civil war, and some of us lived through it throughout the period of the 80s and before that. But when it ended, at least for the most part of this country, we were plunged into a different kind of civil war that is of an economic nature. Now, the economic civil war does not have casualties in the form of dead bodies lying in Luwero or in northern Uganda or in Soroti or anywhere else, but in form of dead dreams that have been frozen and mummified in the minds and the hearts of 40 million Ugandans. So it kind of started as a Cold War throughout the 90s when the privatization process was riddled with what some people called corruption, but which in fact was looting, as resources that previously belonged to the nation were passed on to individuals and their families. And I call it a Cold War because it was done quietly and outside of the gaze of a majority of Ugandans, and that's because this government still cared about public opinion. But when they ceased to care about public opinion and descended deeper and deeper into tyranny, what was previously looting became a plunder, and then ultimately they became completely entitled in their minds to every resource in this country. And now it ceased to be a Cold War and it became a brazen conflict, pitting on the one hand a group of people who are so small they can fit in one room, who believe that they're entitled to everything that this country has, and I'll call them the Indomitables. And on the other hand, a bigger group of almost the rest of Ugandans who they feel do not have an entitlement to anything and who are just supposed to survive at best. And I'll call those the space fillers. Now, the only reason the space fillers own anything, be it a business, a piece of land, or property, is because it hasn't yet caught the fancy of the Indomitables. Now, if it does, they'll be given a diminished price for it and be forced to sell. That's if they are lucky. If they are unlucky, it might just be taken completely. So because they are land grabbers, they are business grabbers, they can grab anything, and now they do it brazenly and they don't care about public opinion. They ceased to do that about 15 or perhaps 20 years ago. So when you see headlines like this, for instance, this one ran in January of 2016, saying that Museveni spends 27 billion shillings on campaigns in just 2 months. Of course, that was just a month before the general elections in that year. And then you see another one 2 months later, in March after the election, saying that Bank of Uganda has been hit by a fraud of the same amount of money, 27 billion. Now, of course, we know who the thieves are, and they don't care if we know. Previously, they did when they still cared about public opinion. Now they don't care. All that matters is that there was a fraud here, and we all know where the money went. Or when you see something like this, 181 billion shillings loan has been taken from the World Bank to fight locusts. And then not long afterwards, court awards the same amount of money, 181 billion, to an unknown, nondescript company owned by some pastor for the same amount of money, 181 billion. So then you know where the money that came from the World Bank loan went, and everybody can see it. It is in open view. They no longer care. About 1 year ago, I wrote a rant about oil and how crude oil was being siphoned out from the oil wells in Hoima and Pakwach and transported in trucks and taken and sold as crude. Now, I came under a lot of criticism for that particular writing, and I was attacked as somebody who didn't know what I was talking about, from people in the oil sector, from the regime apologists and their surrogates. And one of the biggest things they told me is it's not commercially viable to transport crude oil all those distances and go and sell it that way. But then not long after, Kenya comes up and dismantles that argument because they show that they are selling their crude oil and actually making a good profit out of it. And then now, they discover their oil 10 years after Uganda, and they have been selling it and making some money out of it. But then some people would want to believe that we are just sitting on ours and we are dare not sell it as crude. You really have to be a special kind of stupid to believe that, especially when you realize that the trucks which have been transporting the Kenyan crude oil look something like this. And then you also realize that the people in Hoima have been seeing trucks that look like this coming for so many years from the oil wells in Butiaba region and passing through the Hoima town and going God knows where. And so you really have to believe that perhaps they are carrying sewage or something like that, but we all know what they are carrying. And we all know that we have been selling crude for so many years. And then you also discover that world websites such as this one, worldexports.com, list Uganda as 91st in the world for crude oil exports. So then you wonder, where is the crude oil that Uganda has been exporting, since the oil in Hoima and somewhere is somehow frozen in the ground, waiting for true exploration. The truth, though, is we have been selling crude. It's not supposed to be known by the space fillers. That is for the exclusivity of the Indomitables. Now then you look at headlines like this, 700 billion oil fund spent quietly, and that came out of the Daily Monitor. Then you look at another headline which actually came out of government sources, talking about how a lot of money is being lost through oil contracts and things like that. So every time you see that the government is losing money, and you just see the government is losing money, it's not the government losing money, it's the space feeders losing money, and it's the Indomitables scoring a goal, and they continue to score goals after goal after goal, and the space feeders are just now spectators. We are supposed to be opponents in one way, but now we've been turned into spectators. And then there is the issue of gold, which now is our biggest export earner, because last year Uganda earned $1.25 billion from gold exports. Almost all of them exclusively, about 99.9, went to the United Arab Emirates. And that is double from what was the previous year, which was about $513 million. So now, when you see this, then you realize that there is very little tax paid of gold exports. Why? Indomitables. There is very little of accountability of all the $1.52 billion in as far as revenue for the country is concerned. Why? Indomitables. Then you look at headlines like this: Uganda loses money through illicit gold trade, or through gold contracts which are unscrupulous, and things like that. Every time you see something of the like, the Indomitables are continuing to score, and the space fillers are expected to just stand up and cheer, and cheer every goal that is being scored by the Indomitables. Now what happens is the space fillers, because they have to survive, continue to go and find safe places where they can do some small businesses, import here, trade here, some small farming and so on, purely to survive, because they are not expected to thrive. Now what happens is, because the appetite of the Indomitables continues to grow, they move deeper and deeper into what was previously the safe spaces of the nobodies or the space fillers. And then eventually the space fillers find that there is no place left to run, because now almost every business is being invaded by the Indomitables. So at that stage, they must stand up and fight, because what's left is they're going to be pushed off the cliff. I'm sure you've heard it being said that money does not change people. It just magnifies what those people always were. For instance, somebody does not become arrogant because they have money. They were arrogant all along. Money just gave them a platform to manifest that arrogance. And so by the same token, this whole coronavirus thing wasn't of anybody's making, at least not anybody within the confines of this country. Neither was the lockdowns that followed. But my God, it gave them a platform on which to manifest what they have always wanted to do. Get the space feeders, lock them up somewhere, silence their voices, have only one voice, as the Indomitables continue to expand their territory and, especially take loot that has been taken through loans that are now available as a result of all this COVID-19 thing. And then also, while all voices of opposition were somewhere locked away, the Indomitables understand that this regime has to come to an end very soon. So while we were away, they were sitting in secret meetings some places and deciding for themselves who they want to take over from the current government. Why? They want somebody who is going to guarantee that the system will continue as it has been, the Indomitables versus the space feeders, and also somebody who will guarantee the safety of their loot. Throughout history, we've seen pictures that have come to define time periods. For instance, this picture that features a young man called Mbuisa Makubu carrying the lifeless body of Hector Peterson came to define the Soweto uprising of 1976 and the massacre that followed, and ultimately actually defined the entirety of the apartheid era. In much the same way, this headline in the New Vision newspaper in 1989 and this picture in the same newspaper in the same year came to define Uganda's fight against HIV and AIDS, and especially the savage manner in which it decimated its victims before it brought them down to their grave. And so by the same token, this picture will forever define Uganda's economic civil war, taken in March 2020 at State House, when the president called members of his cabinet and was demonstrating to them how 2.6 kilograms of kawunga can be used to feed one person for 10 days. Even the ministers were quietly shocked behind their masks. Now think about this. Here is a president whose State House has a budget that is over 400 billion Uganda shillings every year. And when you take off the salaries and wages, it comes to about 377 billion every year. That means that he spends 1 billion shillings, in excess of that, every day on State House. So now here is a man on whom the taxpayers are lavishing 1 billion shillings every day. And yet he has the audacity to sit and tell those very people on whose backs he's riding how they should be distributing government kawunga and not using it wastefully. And guess what? That was the budget until the end of June of 2020. In the new budget, they have asked for an increment of 66%. That means if that is granted and if the budget is passed as it is, that means that State House will be spending $500,000 every day being lavished on this man. And yet he has the audacity to tell us how to be using the kawunga optimally. Now that shows that this economic civil war has reached its peak. The Indomitables have totally lost touch with anything that is of reality. Now they exist in their own reality. So how does Uganda's State House budget compare to other countries? I'll tell you this. Kenya spends the Uganda shillings equivalent of 210 billion shillings on their State House. That's just above half of what we spend. And yet their budget is at least 3 times bigger than ours. So they have a lot more money, but they spend much less on their president than poor Uganda does on our president. Now something has to give, because the space feeders no longer have any spaces to run to. They are being squeezed tightly into a corner, even as the government on their behalf takes big loans, which they are going to have to pay. And now they have to stand up and say it's about time that this war comes to an end. Now the economic civil war will not come to an end until the people of this country rise up and say we are tired of being nobodies no more in our own country. We are going to install a government that fits into our dreams and one that can work for us, rather than one that has been imposed on us by the previous administration. Now that has to happen because something has to give. We cannot continue at this rate any longer. There is no space left to run. Somehow we have to stand up and fight back and claim what is ours. My name is Joseph Kabuleta, and I'm asking you to reclaim our country and our kin.